All right, we're back with Talk of the Neighborhoods. I'm Joe Heisler, your host. Tonight, a two-part show, but all about the city of Boston finances. Of course, it is budget season. The State House of Representatives just came out with their budget. The city came out with their Mayor Wu's budget, and the City Council is now taking it up and looking at it. And joining us in this segment to talk about that and all things budgetary, political. It's all about the money at the end of the day. We have the executive director of the Boston Policy Institute. It's a new think tank that was created in the last couple of years. Greg Maynard joins us. Nice to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for coming in. Well, the City Council has it now. And we were just talking with Marty Walsh from the Boston Municipal Research Bureau, and she's saying that, of course, the budget is based on existing resources and funds, and that, so to speak, not to worry, that by and large, most of the money that to fund the mayor's budget is there, because it's, one, heavily dependent on property taxes, and those are controlled by the city of Boston. But tell us now, because your group has taken a closer look at some of the city's finances and the impacts of some of the decisions that are being made. And where are we at on it now?
Yeah, so I think that what we heard from the administration over the last couple of weeks is that Boston's budget growth this year is the lowest of Mayor Wu's term. It was only about 4%. The budget grew 8% last year, and Boston's budget growth is based on one thing. It's based on how much more revenue the city thinks it's going to be able to take in. And the fact is that the city's revenue collection is slowing down. Property tax revenue growth is estimated to be about the same as last year, maybe a little less than last year. And what we're seeing is that falling office values, which BPI wrote a report about last year, are really having an impact on the city's budget. We saw commercial property values fall 5% last year, and that is moving the tax burden onto the backs of residential property owners. So that means homeowners. And what we're seeing is a city government that is not as interested in raising the budget when the people who are paying for those increases are homeowners instead of the downtown landlords.
Some would say smartly so. If you don't, you're not going to have the money. You're not going to be able to. Yet, they just signed a new contract with the Boston Teachers Union, and that may not have an effect on this year's budget. But could be. Next year's and longer term impacts.
Yeah, so this new budget that was signed with BTU, so the city came out with, the contract was originally signed the day before the mayor's State of the City speech back in March, and so details were released at the Boston School Committee's meeting last week on Wednesday night, and what we heard about was that like Marty Walsh had mentioned earlier, this is going to cost about $181 million, but a lot of that, like $88 million of it, is going to come for paying the FY25 budgets that we're in now.
Yeah.
Right, that's about like $33 million more there, and then $55 million for FY26. But all that money is coming out of this. It's called a reserve fund that the city sets aside for settling new contracts. So all the money's coming out of that. But that fund is about $102 million. So we're talking about $88 million out of that $102 million being spent just on this contract. And that means that this $33 million for FY25, this $55 million for FY26, that means that this spending was above and beyond what the city thought it was going to be spending on BPS's budget. So that means that this contract is going to cost the city a lot of money moving forward. This contract only lasts for 3 years, but this very likely sets kind of the pace that the city's going to see teachers' salaries rise, going forward.
Well, and so potentially, but we may not feel the impact for another year or two. Is that what you're saying?
So the impact of
because this special fund, some would refer to it as a rainy day fund, I guess.
Yeah, so it'll be in the FY27 budget. We'll see it like integrated into that budget, right? So it's been set aside. But this $55 million that's going to be spent for FY26. That's more than BPS's budget grew by this year. So I think that the BPS budget grew by about $45 million. So I think that gives you a good sense of just how big these costs are, right? The amount of money that's going to be paid out for FY26 for the BTU contract is greater than the amount of money that BPS's budget is going up by. So it means that we're paying for existing labor.
Good investment?
I mean, I don't this budget negotiation was, there wasn't a lot of public information about it. Most of the information that came out was coming from BTU's side. And I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions. One of the big focuses from BTU was inclusion, which is this thing that we've heard a lot about from BPS and from BTU. BTU thinks they got a big victory on how BPS is doing inclusion. But we haven't heard much about what that means for students at any of either the school committee or the city council hearings. There's been some behind closed doors briefings that BPS has given to the city council, but those aren't recorded, they're not televised, and so we just don't really know that much about what's going on with inclusion after this new contract.
Is that different? I mean, is the transparency different under this administration than it has been in the past?
I don't think it's so much different under this administration. I think it's really under this. I think this city council has been much more willing to do things behind closed doors and to not have hearings and to not hold things up. I think it's very fair to say. I mean, one big note that we've made in this budget, BPI has made in this budget, is that the mayor's budgets, FY23, 24, 25, about 99% of the budget that she proposed in April has gone into law in June. And if you remember, the city council had a big reform that was on the 2021 ballot.
Yeah, they have more leverage.
They have more leverage, they have more power. That's what we heard. But the actual result of it has been that these budgets are actually changing less than they were changing before those reforms, right? It seems like the city council just hasn't really gotten its arms around how to use this power. And if there is not a veto-proof majority on the council for big changes to the budget, the council's not capable of doing that. And right now, the council has not been able to create that veto-proof majority. This is something that I think could be a whole other show, but the council just doesn't have the staff manpower to really understand the budget, right? More than 100 people work for the finance department in the city of Boston. In Boston City Council, you have one staffer who does a good job. You have a couple of other staff who work on this stuff. But if you compare Boston City Council to the state senate or the state house,
their staffs.
They have very large staffs, right, who really know a lot about the budget and who work hand in hand with the governor to create that budget. You don't have that same kind of staffing or relationship between the council, right, or expertise between the council and the administration.
Very interesting. Well, so the council and the Ways and Means chair is Brian Worrell, I believe. He's still there. They're currently reviewing the budget. Do you anticipate any changes then?
No. So I mean,
and were you able to, based on the information you have, has your think tank issued any recommendations to them?
Yeah, so we have been doing budget previews. So if people can check out our Substack. We're at bostonpolicyinstitute.substack.com, and our website's bostonpolicyinstitute.org. And we have previews on what's happening every week, what the budget was in 25 versus 26, and what the big things are that we're watching for. But based on what's happened the last 3 budgets, which is that 99% of it of what the mayor proposes passes into law, we think that that's very likely to happen again.
Right. So anticipate no major changes.
Yeah.
Well, of course, we're in the midst of a mayoral election, and so all things are political. Everything's looked at through that prism, through that lens. Given that, and it's not just the teachers' contract. There's been a lot of other unions. The contracts have been approved. As the mayor kind of bought union peace, so to speak, and it's an election year. She's gotten endorsements from a lot of these unions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Bigger union contracts have certainly been a chunk of, are certainly a big chunk of what's driving the growth of Boston's budget. It's something that we're not just seeing in Boston, right? We're seeing it all across the state of Massachusetts, and kind of anemic budget growth and really having a tough time making ends meet is something we're seeing across Massachusetts, right? We've seen a number of towns with operational overrides, right? So overrides just to pay for the regular budget, not to build a school or a police station or something.
Boston's not in that position.
Boston's not in that, but the fact that you're seeing this kind of fiscal distress out in the towns, I think that much more than what's happening in Washington, D.C. is what's driving Boston, right? Boston's budget is weak because of things that happened prior to Donald Trump being elected, right? Falling office values, super high office vacancy rates, super high lab office vacancy rates. Those all predate the president.
What about that? Is that situation stabilizing? I mean, we're seeing, post-pandemic, a lot of vacancies. There's still a lot of employees working from home, and so talking about the office vacancy rate, has that stabilized at all? And has your institute looked at that?
Yeah, it hasn't. It's continued to kind of tick up here. We just saw new news that Fidelity is not going to move into the new South Station tower, right? So there's going to be some new towers opening with basically no tenants. You just saw another building trade this week for less than its pre-COVID value. And so BPI is actually working right now on, we're going to hopefully have, before the end of this budget season, we're going to have a new report on, or an updated report on the office values for the city of Boston. So we're going to do an update to our February report. But what our preliminary numbers show is that the numbers that BPI released last year were probably optimistic, and that things could actually be worse than they were. So
How so?
BPI, just because office values are dropping, the drop in office values is deeper than we anticipated in the report last year.
Well, very interesting. Again, Greg Maynard is the executive director of the Boston Policy Institute, a think tank, I think it's been called. I don't know.
Policy-focused nonprofit.
Nonprofit that researches and offers advice on finance and other matters. Talking about that, well, given that, the perhaps drop and or at least not the kind of increase that the city and other financial people would like to see. Was Mayor Wu wrong in asking the legislature for the authority to alter the classification and the rates to try and lessen the impact? And so does this mean in years forward, residents could see even greater increases?
I mean, I think the fact is that I think was not talked about enough during the debate over the mayor's tax shift last year is residential tax rates are going to go up no matter if the mayor's tax shift had passed or not. The question is just how much they're going to go up for this very short period of time. And that's really important to understand because in Boston, especially in the last 20 years, the city's budget has grown mostly on the back of all this new construction downtown, all these new office towers. Growth. And there is very little new growth, right? There aren't a heck of a lot of cranes in the air right now in Boston. And so what that means is that the growth in property tax revenue is going to be on the back of homeowners, not on downtown office towers. And that's a really serious problem that I don't think the administration has done very much to address. You look all across the country and people are, business communities and nonprofits and governments are working together on downtown revitalization. And in Boston, I don't think you've seen that same kind of focus on downtown revitalization.
That brings up what could they be doing? What should they be doing? I mean, is there any way to avoid that in reality?
So the drop in office values is happening and is going to continue to happen. But I think there are definitely things that the city can do to to try to revitalize its downtown and keep its downtown a place that people want to come and visit. And
they're talking about converting some of these office buildings to housing. Is that a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that, New York City had a lot of success with after 9/11. They were able to convert an awful lot of office buildings into residences, and they were able to, kind of revitalize that neighborhood. But you're seeing other things, in Pittsburgh, there was a big announcement, with all of the city's leaders for a $600 million revitalization of their downtown. You've seen really important work from the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. They did a report last year. They did one in February looking at what can be done in downtown Boston. And it does not seem like that work has much attention has been paid to that work in City Hall.
Why is that? What do you think is under her leadership? She brought in a lot of new people, and she kept her word. She said she was going to do this, and she has. She's brought in a lot of different people that weren't necessarily part of the conversation before. Are they just not aware of the financial implications of some of these decisions, or what's behind that?
Yeah, I can't. I couldn't tell you what's behind that, but I do know that if you compare Boston's efforts at downtown revitalization to other cities across the country, Boston's just not doing a heck of a lot, and Boston is extremely dependent on these downtown properties, right? Boston gets more than 72% of its revenue from property taxes, and more than half of that is coming from these office towers. So
is that different than other cities, though?
Oh yes, it's very, very different.
Yeah. And what is the reason for that? Why is Boston so dependent on property?
So other places around the country, Massachusetts is kind of a unique place. Generally, we don't have county government, right? We have 351 cities and towns. And so as a result, because of Proposition 2.5, because of how people feel about taxation, it doesn't make a lot of sense to allow 351 cities and towns to each set their own sales tax rate and each set their own income tax. New York City collects income tax. And, the city will say this, and they're right. Property taxes are an extremely reliable, very dependable form of revenue. You know exactly how much you're going to collect every year. And so what that means is Boston's budget is very, stable. But it also means that Boston's budget is very dependent on these downtown office buildings, and and the fact that they are collapsing in value is something that is obviously really worrying to the administration, right? Like they spent all of last year fighting for this tax shift, and resubmitted it again this year, right? So it's clearly a really big priority for them.
In the face of some opposition, so I think it's fair to say, I don't know how organized opposition from the business community, but and coming in now this year in the midst of a mayoral election, highly charged or potentially highly charged, does it get kind of caught up in this kind of political maelstrom, and where we can't tell the forest from the trees, so to speak, because there's all these kind of competing claims and suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly this is something that probably does get caught in that. But I also think that elections are a time to kind of talk about what is going on in the city and what people prioritize. We're going through the budget process right now at the city council, right? The planning department is going to come up, right? That was a big piece for this administration, that they moved all the planners out of the BPDA and they brought them into the city. The city has imposed higher costs on developers for environmental rules, for inclusionary zoning, and in a city as dependent on new growth and on property taxes as Boston is, I think it's worth asking those questions of were these policies good ideas? How if you really need new growth, how important are these costs? Are these costs worth sacrificing new growth, right? There's a lot of academic research that says increasing inclusionary zoning requirements on housing developments reduces the total number of units built in a city. And we've got new data out that says this is the worst start for home builds in Metro Boston in 13 years.
How much influence do you think that'll have on the electorate, though? So much has been focused on Mayor Wu standing up to the Trump administration and saying, we're not governed by kings or wannabe kings, blah, 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 blah. Does that get lost? How much influence do you think the business community has in that? Of course, Mayor Wu's chief opponent is, of course, Joshua Kraft, who's, he was a nonprofit leader, I think that's fair to say, and philanthropist, but seems to have some backing from the business community.
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at what happened last year with how much focus was spent on this tax shift and how much the administration and its allies talked about what the impact would be on homeowners, it's really clear that homeowners' taxes are a major priority for this administration and for the city council. And it seems like if that's the case, right, if you're really worried about homeowners' property tax bills going up, then being concerned about what's happening with downtown office, like they are being driven up by downtown office values, right? As those office values fall, the amount of money the city is, very quick to say this, the amount of money the city collects will not go down. What will change is who is paying those taxes. And as commercial property values drop, homeowners will pay a greater and greater share of the city's property tax.
Well, what's the alternative? I guess it would be to cut the budget.
That's right.
Right? And is that something like, for instance, your institute is recommended?
So we haven't, we mostly are identifying, quantifying issues, right? Like this falling office values thing was something people were talking about, but they didn't know how much or what the impact was going to be. We were able to quantify that. In terms of, that it's something that in other cities in Massachusetts that depend much more heavily than Boston on homeowners for their local revenue,
right.
They do not go to the levy every year for their taxes, and that is a fact, right? If you look at Springfield and Brockton and Lowell and the other gateway cities, they don't always go to the levy, and that is an option, right? The city, is not required by law to increase the levy to the maximum amount allowable by law. Now, Boston has, right? Boston has always gone to the maximum levy allowed by law, but it doesn't have to.
Right. Well, we've got just a few minutes left. I want to ask you about your institute. Sure. Of course, there's been some written about it, suggesting that you've been critical of the administration in some ways. That somehow it's the funding for your institute brings into question the authenticity and the validity of your research, and I wanted to give you a chance to address that.
Yeah, I mean, so Boston Policy Institute, Inc., we're a 501c4, and so, when we put this organization together, one of the, we were talking about some of these issues, falling office values. Marty Wells also talked about the systematic improvement plan between BPS and the state. BPI put a report out on that, and one of the things that BPI was kind of founded on is the idea that if we're able to put out these reports, we can create space for new conversation. And what we thought was that there was some fear about putting out these reports about what the blowback would be if you put out reports that say, for instance, that the city is facing this enormous fiscal crisis and that homeowners' taxes are going to go way up, right? That people did not want to go out there and say that. And I think the falling office values report that BPI put out last February, that could have been produced at any time in the year prior. And I think it's worth asking why that didn't happen. The BPS report that BPI released in March, Pioneer Institute did a report sort of like that in 2022, but BMRB, Marty was just on, they haven't put out any original research on BPS or on falling office values or on the budget, right? They're
so
effectively
nobody's
just
doing that research, right. You're saying?
Yes, no one is. No one did the research on the office. The office values report that BPI put out remains the only report like that put out by an organization here in Boston, and and so BPI's not, and so that's why BPI is set up the way it was, and kind of is going forward on this, because we've been able to create this big conversation, right? Without BPI's report, I think the conversation around the tax shift proposal last year, around the budget, around what's going on with property taxes, all of that would have been much poorer without the report. Same for the BTU contract and BPS, like having this report done about how BPS has performed over the course of the systematic improvement plan. That's really important to understanding all of this stuff.
But I think what was implied, and again, it's probably unfair criticism, is that somehow, your organization carries water for some special interest.
Yeah.
And you know the money that you're getting to support the organizations somehow.
You know, and I think one of the important things that BPI did and how we're doing this research is, so I founded the organization. I'm the executive director. I'm not the person who wrote the reports, right? So the Falling Office Values reports was produced by the Center for State Policy Analysis at Tufts University by Evan Horowitz, who does a lot of work for a lot of people. He's very well respected. He's one of the people who goes before Chair Mikowitz and talks about what the budget is going to be, what the revenue is going to be for the state of Massachusetts. The education report was produced by Dr. Kerry Donahue, who just started as the executive director for TFA Massachusetts. Who's a very well-respected education policy person.
So you're getting your resources and your reports from a variety of
right. Yeah, we're bringing in experts who can be relied upon.
Would you call yourself a business-backed group, like Boston Municipal Research Bureau is?
I mean, Boston Municipal Research Bureau is, they've been around for a century, right? They were founded by like Yankee businessmen, like during Mayor Curley's administration. I think that, they have a really important role to play, but they're much different. It's a much different organization. I think we're much newer and kind of finding this space. So,
Greg Maynard is the executive director of the Boston Policy Institute, and thanks so much for coming and joining us.
Thank you.
You're watching Talk to the Neighborhoods. We're here tonight and every Thursday night at the same time. Next week, former State Senator Diane Wilkerson will be my guest. Till then, for all the entire staff and crew here at BNN, have a pleasant evening. Good night. Sorry, there was...